Almost a year since the beginning of the war on Gaza, the British government continues to support Israel's assault in violation of its own laws.
Well, we still have many governments, including the UK government, continuing to send arms to Israel, and I believe every single person that is responsible or complicit in those war crimes, in those breaches of international law, must be held to account.
Always clear with us.
Humza Yousaf, Scotland's former First Minister, tells us why he believes that Britain is complicit in war crimes in Gaza.
It's better that the UK government is open and transparent now before such trials take place.
Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri. Welcome to Bigger Than Five. Today we focus on one of the most pressing issues facing Western political leaders: the mounting public pressure on governments to stop fueling Israel's war on Gaza. We look at the role of great powers like the United Kingdom as they continue to provide military, political, and diplomatic cover for Israel. Last month, the Scottish government announced that it was suspending meetings with Israeli ambassadors until, quote, real progress was made in ceasefire negotiations. Earlier this month, the British government suspended 30 out of a total of 350 weapons licenses to Israel. But crucially, it continues to provide Israel with parts for F-35 fighter jets used in its deadly attacks on civilians in Gaza. As millions across the UK and Europe continue to protest against their government's complicity in the mass killing of Palestinians, there is also a rising tide of Islamophobia and far-right extremism. On today's program, we examine the tensions between those calling for justice and accountability and the broader support for arms sales to Israel. One political leader who has spoken forcefully against Israel's attacks on Gaza and called for a ceasefire is Humza Yousaf, Scotland's former First Minister and leader of the Scottish National Party, which advocates independence from the United Kingdom.
It is right for the world to condemn the actions of Hamas unequivocally. But any form of collective punishment, as we're seeing in Gaza, can never be justified.
I'm sad that my time as First Minister is ending.
He had no choice but to resign. With the imminent vote of no confidence.
Humza was great with the war in Gaza, and it makes me a bit worried about the prospect of Scottish independence in the future.
We're now joined by Humza Yousaf, who led the Scottish government from March 2023 to May 2024. Humza Yousaf, last October you stood out from other British politicians by calling for an end to Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Today, 11 months on, are you surprised that there is still no permanent ceasefire and no end in sight to the mass killing of Palestinians?
I'm not just surprised, I'm shocked and I'm disgusted. We have had at least 40,000 people who have been killed, not died, not passed away, but been killed. The overwhelming majority, of course, innocent of any crime. Tens of thousands of children killed, massacred, and yet there has been virtually no sanction on the government of Israel for such a massacre, and yet governments, particularly Western governments, are sending arms to the government of Israel. And the UK government, although it has suspended around about 30 licenses, that's out of 350 export licenses to Israel, and of course the F-35 jet program is excluded from any consideration under that ban. So we still have many governments, including the UK government, continuing to send arms to Israel. And I believe every single person that is responsible or complicit in those war crimes, in those breaches of international law, must be held to account.
But how do you hold the British government accountable? The UK's own Export Control Act states that the government must not grant arms licenses if there is even a risk that they will be used in violations.
So not only do I think there is a domestic legal implication not to send arms to Israel, but there is, of course, our obligations under international law. And if you look at the ICJ investigation into genocide, or potential genocide being committed in Gaza, and I've got little doubt that that is happening, then we look at the interim orders from the ICJ, and of course they make it very clear that no government in the world should be facilitating breaches of international law and potential war crimes. So for me, there is a need to hold the UK government to account, and if our domestic law doesn't allow us to do that, then of course there should be recourse for international law.
When you were First Minister back in April, you wrote a letter to the British Prime Minister at the time, Rishi Sunak, calling on the UK government to ban arms exports to Israel. You said, quote, "By not stopping arms sales to Israel, the UK is in danger of being complicit in the killing of innocent civilians." You stopped short of saying it was complicit.
Well, let me be clear. I think they are being complicit. I don't think there can be any doubt in that, given, as I say, the significant level of atrocity that we've seen, the very obvious and egregious breaches of international law that we have witnessed. How can there be any doubt? If you're selling arms and providing arms to the very government that is committing such breaches, how can you not be complicit? But interestingly, I never got a response, I have to say, to that letter. And the UK government, I'm afraid, doesn't seem willing to engage in this issue in any depth.
But let me ask you how you explain your own government's position. When you were First Minister, you'd been calling for an end to Israel's assault on Gaza while your own government was still funding the very companies that were fueling the war. A government agency, the Scottish Enterprise, was giving grants to arms companies supplying weapons to Israel. How do you explain this contradiction?
No, so very easily, actually. It's not a contradiction. The money that Scottish Enterprise had given, and this was, by the way, of course, before the terrible atrocities, was actually given to a number of arms companies to diversify away from arms.
But how do companies like Raytheon and BAE diversify away from arms?
Well, instead of putting their efforts and energy into arms, they can look at other areas of exploration, space exploration, for example, or some other areas of technology, as an example. So we want companies in Scotland to diversify away from the arms trade. But look, all of this...
But that's not what pressure groups were saying.
Pardon?
That's not what pressure groups in Scotland have been saying.
I think you could probably look on the record if you wish, and you've got every right, of course, to ask me the questions that you're asking, but I don't think there can be any doubt whatsoever about the Scottish Government's position on the issue of Gaza. I was the first European leader to call for a ceasefire.
But precisely, I ask you this because, of course, you have shown clear moral leadership. You've made strong statements when it comes to the need to have a ceasefire in Gaza, but the actions of your government have not been the same. Amnesty International said that it was staggering that arms firms supplying the Israeli military had been waived through Scottish Enterprise due diligent processes.
Well, remember, Scottish Enterprise, although it acts, of course, independently and autonomously, though they receive funding, of course, from the Scottish government. But is there more that the Scottish government can do? We should always be open to exploring that, particularly around trade and investment. But our position has been clear on the current massacre and atrocities that we see. There must be an immediate ceasefire. There must be an end to all sales, arms sales, to Israel, and there must be the immediate recognition of the Palestinian state. And I think as a government, we've managed to show that leadership over the last 11 months.
In addition to the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians killed, there were 3 British aid workers who were killed last April. You mentioned them in your letter to the Prime Minister at the time, asking for an independent investigation, for accountability. There hasn't been either. We've also learned since that the UK was flying spy planes over Gaza at the time. The government, it's been reported, won't release the tapes that it has. Is the new Labour government in the UK, in your view, covering up for Britain's direct involvement in Israel's war crimes?
Well, look, I've got to try to hold on to some kind of hope that the current UK Labour administration will be different to the Conservative administration. The Conservative administration, frankly, did not do, I think, anything that was helpful in terms of its international legal obligations, didn't do enough in order to ensure it was adhering to its obligations under international law. We've seen
But are you seeing
changes.
anything significant that suggests a fundamental shift?
The changes in tone that I've seen have been around, even if it was only 10% of arms licenses, at least a step in the right direction. But we need the UK government to go further. The immediate steps it must take are halting all arms sales to Israel, and it should, of course, recognise the Palestinian state. It shouldn't wait for some mythical process in the future. You see, you cannot believe in a two-state solution, but only recognise one state. So there has to be the immediate recognition of the Palestinian state. And the UK government should say absolutely unequivocally that they support any action the ICC is taking, and that those, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, if there is an arrest warrant that is granted for him, then should he set foot in the United Kingdom, then he would be immediately arrested. This is the absolute minimum that should be done by the UK government.
Do you believe the UK government should come clean about the scope of its involvement?
Without a doubt, transparency is absolutely vital, especially when I say this is the most egregious breach of international law that I've seen in my lifetime.
Would you go as far as to say that there is a cover-up?
At the very least, there is a complete lack of transparency. Now, the Labour administration are a few months old. My appeal to the Prime Minister would be to be absolutely open and transparent. I'm a firm believer that there will be international tribunals held for those responsible for such dreadful breaches of international law and such war crimes. And it is better that the UK government is open and transparent now before such trials take place.
Let me ask you about your wife's parents. They were visiting family in Gaza when the war erupted. How did that affect your view of the situation?
Well, my father-in-law and mother-in-law travelled there to visit my wife's gran, who is 94 years old now, 93 in October the 7th last year. Look, the 4 weeks that my mother-in-law and father-in-law were in Gaza were amongst the most difficult 4 weeks of our lives. We did not know day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, whether they would be alive or whether they would die. And I'm afraid that is the constant reality for those that are still trapped in Gaza. And my wife still has family there. Her cousin with their 4 children and her husband are still there in Gaza. We wait for updates on a regular basis, and we haven't heard from them for many days. And I couldn't tell you in truth whether they're alive or not.
How difficult was it for you personally and politically to distance yourself from what was going on? We know the SNP has a traditionally strong pro-Palestine base, but how much support from the party did you receive for your pushback against the British position on Israel and Israel's actions?
My party actually, I wouldn't necessarily categorise our position as being pro-Palestinian. I think we're pro-international law. And that means that you automatically must support, I believe, the rights of the Palestinian people to their own state and to the end of an occupation, because occupation is illegal under international law. But I suppose to answer your question, was there some nervousness in my party when I said very early on, days after October the 7th, that I was going to demand a ceasefire because it was the right thing to do, not just for the people of Gaza, but of course, so that hostages could be released and reunited with their loved ones. There was, frankly, some concern that was raised, but I believed it was the right thing to do. And I believe when we look back at this terrible, dreadful chapter in our history, I hope that I will be seen as being on the right side.
Is the recent decision by the Scottish government to suspend its meetings with Israeli ambassadors for the time being, in your opinion, a sign that Scotland's stance towards Israel is beginning to shift?
I think we have to be able to show leadership. Our foreign affairs are still controlled by the UK government. That is the reality of the constitutional setup that we have. But I think it is important for countries like ours to show some element of leadership. And you cannot have normal diplomatic relations with a country whose prime minister there's an ICC arrest warrant being sought for him for the most egregious and excessive breaches of international law and for the committal of war crimes.
As the first Muslim to become First Minister of Scotland and the first Muslim leader of a major UK party, how important was it for you to address some of these concerns within your own community?
Well, hugely important. And I never viewed myself as being a representative just for the Muslim community. Of course not. As First Minister, you represent all communities. And that's why I never dismissed the feelings of the Jewish community, for example. The Jewish community here in Scotland, they were feeling, and I think continue to feel, fearful about any anti-Semitism, about concerns that they had for their loved ones in Israel. And that's why days after October the 7th, I went to the synagogue, the biggest synagogue in the country. And I met with and hugged, in fact, the mother of Bernard Cowan, one of those who was killed by Hamas during that dreadful attack on October the 7th, and met with the Jewish community time and time and time again. And we didn't always agree, of course not, on the geopolitical situation, but we could absolutely agree on the fact that what's happening in Israel and Gaza cannot be used in any way, shape, or form for justification for anti-Semitism.
You mentioned anti-Semitism, and you've always spoken out against institutional racism in Britain. What, in your opinion, was the key driver in the riots that broke out last August in some of the major cities in Britain, where violent mobs targeted Black and brown communities, especially Muslims? What was the key driver, in your opinion?
It's very simple. These riots did not happen in a vacuum. They are a direct result, and I emphasize that word, direct result, of years of mainstreaming far-right rhetoric into our political and media discourse here in the United Kingdom. So years of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric that has gone unchecked, in fact, has been openly encouraged, to the point where we had a former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, so one of the most senior positions in the United Kingdom government, writing an article in one of the biggest papers, biggest broadsheets in the UK, The Telegraph, writing an article saying that Islamists and anti-Semites are taking over the country. And an incendiary dog whistle designed to turn community against community. And that was coming from one of the most senior politicians in the entire country. So these riots didn't happen in a vacuum.
But how do you stop them? How do you stop the spread of Islamophobia? And how do you stop these attacks by white supremacists against members of the Muslim community?
Well, again, it's simple. You have to address the root causes. You have to, first of all, identify it. So you have to call it, as you rightly have, far-right white supremacist thuggery. And then you have to address the root causes. And the root causes demand that politicians are therefore honest about the problems we're facing in society and the solutions. So if I give you one example, there are many complaints from people around housing and the lack of access to affordable housing. And for too many years, politicians have blamed the rise of migration, and that's why you're not able to get a house. Well, that's simply not true. The reason why you can't get a house is because politicians over the years have not invested enough in social housing. In 1979, there was 6.5 million council houses in the UK. There's now just over 2 million council houses in the United Kingdom. That's not the fault of the migrant. That's the fault of political administrations, Labour and Conservative, who haven't invested in social housing.
But by focusing the way you have on racial divisions, aren't you perhaps deepening these societal divisions? Some have accused you of being a blatant racist. Elon Musk, the owner of X, formerly Twitter, says you loathe white people because you once said that 99% of your government meetings are with only one non-white person, you. Do you regret any of the statements you've made in the past, and could you be guilty of deepening some of these racial divisions?
Well, no, I have no regret. In fact, I would make that speech word for word again, because that is the uncomfortable truth. And let's just be frank about Elon Musk. He is somebody who's aligned himself with white supremacy and far-right racist conspiracies. You can see it. I mean, anybody who's been on X, formerly known as Twitter, as I have for many years, has seen a difference since Elon Musk took over. Since he took over, your page is flooded with far-right conspiracy theorists, and he is amplifying them, and amplified them particularly during the Southport riots that we've already spoken about. So let's not think about criticism from Elon Musk as being from some kind of benign, impartial source. It's coming from somebody who has incredible sympathy and alignment with white supremacy and the far right. But Elon Musk is a part of the problem. The deeper malaise that we've got is in the UK, years, if not decades, of anti-migrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric being mainstreamed into our political and media discourse. And until we're honest about that, and until we have a prime minister who's willing to stand up and say, by the way, migration and multiculturalism have been good for our country and are absolutely essential for our future prosperity, then I'm afraid we're never going to get to addressing that root problem.
And you personally have expressed doubt and uncertainty about your future in Scotland due to this rise in Islamophobia. Do you still have these doubts about your sense of belonging?
I do, and every single Muslim I speak to does as well. I've not met a single Muslim that in the United Kingdom who hasn't had a conversation with their partner, with their wife, their husband, their family, to say, look, do we and do our children have a safe future here in the UK, or do we need to think about moving? And that's sad. I mean, look, I'm as Scottish as they come, born here, raised here, educated here, have 3 beautiful children and a beautiful wife here. I led the Scottish government, as you know, for a period. So I'm as Scottish as they come. I don't want to leave Scotland. But could I honestly say, can I look you in the eye and say that my 3 beautiful girls, of mixed heritage, Scottish, Palestinian, Pakistani heritage, will they be safe in this country in the future? And given the way our political discourse is so toxic, and our media discourse and our social media discourse is so toxic, I can't say with honesty that the answer is that they will be safe.
A decade ago, Scotland was extremely close. It was on the verge of leaving the United Kingdom. Is independence, in your view, still within reach?
Absolutely within reach. Look, when I joined this party in the SNP 20 years ago this year, support for independence was barely 30%. It's now consistently at 50-50. And I think that will only increase as time goes on.
But it no longer, the SNP no longer has the majority of seats within the Scottish Parliament. It had a disastrous showing in the last UK general elections. How did you recover from that?
You won't get an argument from me that we took a hammering at those general elections, I'm afraid.
What would it take to recover between now and 2026?
Well, look, a few things. The first thing on that general election result, which is very important, is although the SNP support dropped, support for independence didn't drop. So support for independence is still solid. It may not be absolutely aligned to the SNP support, and that's worrying for the SNP, and we've got to try to rectify that. But support for independence itself remains around 50-50 in terms of 2026. But there's a few things that we have to do. One is that we have to make sure we're talking about the priorities that matter to the people. But also, how do we make sure that independence is not seen as abstract to people's everyday experience? The cost of living crisis that they're facing is absolutely linked to the fact that we don't have control, for example, over our own finances. They're still dictated by the UK government. So there's a power of work for the SNP to do. And the last point I'd make is the challenge for us is that we are 17 years in government. By 2026, that'll be 19 years in government. So we're also fighting the forces of political gravity, and we've got to make sure we deal with that too.
But is the SNP's independence dream over? Do you think that independence can be achieved within your own lifetime?
It will be achieved in my lifetime. Of that, I'm absolutely certain.
What makes you so sure?
Well, I suppose what makes me so sure is that support for independence is at 50-50. And if you look at any poll that has been released on support for independence, we are in the majority for the vast majority of age brackets. It begins to shift once you get to kind of 60 plus, but below that, support for independence tends to be in the majority. So we have to build the popular support on the ground, create the political environment in order for the UK government to find it impossible to grant an independence referendum. So there'll be bumps in the road on the independence journey of that. There can be no doubt. But I have absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Scotland will be an independent country, and it will absolutely be in my lifetime.
Let me just ask you finally, Scotland is a small nation without much clout on the international stage, but what is your vision of independent Scotland's role on the international stage when it comes to human rights and conflict resolution?
I would like an independent Scotland to be a beacon of hope. I would want it to be a good global citizen, one that doesn't lecture others on human rights, but at the same time does raise concerns in an appropriate and sensitive manner. And I think we should do that, whether we're independent or not. But I'd like to see us in a similar vein as Ireland. Ireland is a country that uses its soft power, I think, very well. And on the international stage, although a small country with a small population, still manages to punch above its own weight. Think about the work Ireland has done with Norway and Spain, recently on the international recognition of the Palestinian state. So I think small countries, in fact, studies have shown that small countries can have a huge influence on foreign policy right across the world, and that's what I'd hope for independent Scotland.
Humza Yousaf, former First Minister of Scotland, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
As we've just heard, there is still a role for smaller nations and for outspoken leaders to push for change when it comes to respecting international law and challenging injustice. Voices like Humza Yousaf's reflect a growing unease among many here in the United Kingdom. Is it justifiable for a nation like Britain to enable Israel's destruction in Gaza? And how long can Western democracies continue to arm nations committing such atrocities while claiming to stand for human rights? As the evidence for war crimes in Palestine continues to mount, global leaders face a stark choice: conform to international law or lose what remains of their moral authority. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.